All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start the debate. The motion is to sponsor ban corporations from owning universities. Government is day 1A. Opposition is KRLA. I would like to open the debate by giving the floor to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. On Government Today, we value education. We value good education, we value steady education, and we value objective education. And the thing that we want to make clear is that we recognize that universities, education, and universities in particular require certain resources, naming financial money or any financial resources. And that corporation funding might be a very good idea, might be a very tempting idea in achieving that goal. But just because we have a need, it doesn't mean that we have to go to the extreme. What we're talking about in today's debate is opposing and banning the concept of ownership of universities. We're fine with companies funding universities through other methods that we'll specify in our policy, but the concept of ownership is devastating in achieving the goals of good education, steady education, and again, objective education. So we say that we will not let our education be open and susceptible to the dangers, the financial dangers, financial instability, providing research results that are unreliable, and totally going against the purpose of universities and the value of good education that government promotes in today's debates. But before I move on to my direct argumentation, I'd like to define a few key terms. First, the motion is kind of self-explanatory, but anyway, I'll go with it one by one. First, we define ban, but by not allowing at all. Corporation by companies that are registered as companies in the nation, financial incentives, and other general concept of companies. We'd like to define owning in kind of two ways. First, when there's a clear concept of ownership, for example, in the United States of America, in which the ownership of a certain university is specified, for example, Harvard University is owned by the Board of Education in Harvard, we think that concept strictly applies in today's debate. But in other cases, in which, for example, the new concept of ownership, when it's determined by a share profit, determined by a concept of sharing, for example, 80% of that company, of that university belongs to a certain person, and 20% of the university belongs to a certain person, we think that in that case, the majority share, and namely more than 75%, is the concept of ownership that we're talking about. Especially in examples, for example, Seoul National University was once talking about having this kind of sharing system adopted, and we say in that case this policy applies to that sense too. 75%, and that's what is specified in that kind of system and that kind of law. Universities would like to talk about institutions that provide tertiary education, higher education, and like in that general sense. But before I move on to my arguments, we'd like to define exactly how we're going to tackle this motion. We have a four-step policy. Number one, we're going to again ban any corporation from being the owner of this university. But two, we're going to allow funding. How? We're going to make sure that the corporations can still provide anonymous funds to these universities, providing financial resources and other resources in an inside anonymity. Therefore, the company's name cannot go with the money with the university. So we say, if the university wants to do something good, they should donate, or they should use this channel of providing money to these universities. Thirdly, we say that the government should also provide educational funds, as they already do. And then fourthly, we'll talk about vocational schools, vocational universities, who are strictly concentrated in providing training and provide, for example, getting their students and graduates jobs. In that case, we can also talk about the concept of partnership. For example, in Korean universities, we call it 산학협력단. In the case of these making partnership. Therefore, it's going against the concept of ownership because it doesn't have to do anything with owning that university, but still, in this comprehensive policy, we allow funding and we allow the spirit of the motion. And then with this in mind, I'd like to provide the first two arguments in our case. First, I'd like to talk about the nature of education, and secondly, I'd like to talk about the nature of ownership. No, thank you, sir. First, in the nature of education, I'd like to have two levels of analysis. First, I'd like to talk about the difference of purpose. This is important, because universities have a completely different purpose from companies. Companies are profit-driven. They want to make the most out of resources. They want to make the most out of the money that they put in. But universities don't necessarily function in that way. It doesn't. So it's not about getting the most cheapest professors, but the best professors. And it's not also about providing cheap classrooms, but providing the best education in which these students can learn. And this kind of difference in purpose is actually very big. Why? Because we move on to our second level of analysis. Because there's a different mindset in this case. Because there are different skills required to running a corporation well and running a university well. For example, we like to provide the example of, unfortunately, Hana Academy, in which it was funded by Hana Bank. But in that case, they have a completely different mindset of running a high school and running a corporation. The result of that is, unfortunately, that it has more than like 20% of its class has dropped out, and its teachers are moving out from that school. We say in the long run it may improve, but in the long run it may improve. But the problem is no, thank you, sir. The problem is, waiting for that long run is devastating. And even in the case when it will work, the model won't be corporate ownership, but ownership of education and just corporate funding. So we say that's a very different thing. And then also, schools are doing very well in this case, because without corporate ownership, we have great universities, Harvard University, Seoul National University, Yonsei University, all universities that are owned by corporations. We say we don't see a necessity in having corporate ownership in order to have good universities. And if the problem is lack of funding, we have a policy of anonymous funds of companies funding and providing financial resources and money towards these universities. Secondly, we'd like to talk about the concept of nature of ownership, how these universities are susceptible to the influence of ownership. I'm going to talk about two things here. First, research, and secondly, financial condition. First, research. Because these days, universities are moving on a trend of becoming a research university too. They're still focused on education of students, but a vast majority of its resources is allocated in graduate schools and professors running research projects. They want to have, for example, Harvard University, more than 8% of its funding goes to professors doing research in certain fields such as medical, government, comparative government, and all that. Because that's what sustains their name and reputation, and that's what universities are interested in. And the problem is that when these researchers are funded but are heavily influenced by corporations, it has a problem. And it's not just the sway and whims of the university of the corporate, but 100% death grip on that process. For example, ExxonMobil funds the environmentally friendly studies of Stanford University. The problem is that the research results provided in the Stanford University are heavily contaminated. That's why there were certain trials and law cases, in which that was deemed problematic. The court issued a restraining order in making that not happen. Second, we talk about pharmaceutical companies, in which pharmaceutical companies produce research results that contaminate the objectivity of proving that drug to be safe. We think this is a problem. Secondly, we're going to talk about financial condition. Because corporations are always susceptible to financial risks. And when that corporation goes down, the university goes down too. And we're losing potential good universities, losing potential good research projects, and losing the venue of students to learn higher education. And these companies are always susceptible to the risk. We don't want to make universities susceptible to that risk too. We're very happy to propose.
I would like to, are you ready? All right, I would like to thank the Prime Minister for his speech, and I would like to open the floor to the leader of the opposition.
The proposition came up and told you all about this great policy that they give you in 4 steps. And they said that there's nothing very, they said through this policy, they're firstly going to ban any corporate ownership. Secondly, they're going to give anonymous funds. Thirdly, they're going to have government educational help donations. Fourthly, they're going to have vocational schools. Well, firstly, three of those 4 points are already in the status quo. So basically, their policy is just admitting that there's nothing to change in the status quo. Now, as the leader of the opposition today, what I'm going to do for you is firstly rebut to their case, see all the logical fallacies that were made in their case. Secondly, look at our arguments, our first two arguments, and thirdly, organize this case and organize what I have told you today. But before we move on to that, we on the opposition say one thing. This policy, letting corporations own universities, is a win-win-win situation. It's a win-win-win policy in which students, corporations, and the society in general benefit. All three entities of a society benefit. And to prove this, we bring forth to three very strong arguments. The first argument that we bring forth to you is a higher quality of education. Secondly, we bring forth to you the greater opportunities. Thank you, sir. And the third argument that's going to be expanded on by our deputy leader of the opposition is going to be about the social aspect. And in this argument, we're going to tie up how this policy, how letting corporations own universities, is going to prove a win-win situation for all three entities. But before we move on to that, let's look at their arguments. Firstly, they argued about the nature of education, the difference of purpose, and they claim that university has a completely different purpose from corporations. But in their speech, throughout the Prime Minister's speech, what he actually conceded was that he made a lot of remarks and a lot of statements that actually coincide with universities and corporations. For example, universities have the incentive to give students the best education that the students can gain. What about corporations? Corporations need a workforce that is highly educated, so they have a direct incentive to give students the best education that they can have. Secondly, one of the other remarks he made, universities have direct incentive to sustain their name and their reputation. Doesn't the same thing go for corporations as well? Corporations have a direct incentive to sustain their name and their reputation within the society. And furthermore, this is a direct rebuttal to their case, thank you, sir, about how corporations can actually manipulate the education that students can receive. Because owning a university, as defined by the Prime Minister, isn't just about having having a small part of the school or anything like that. It's a completely different concept from owning a high school. Owning a university is like owning a small part of the society. A society that interacts with the outside world, has ties and has the checks and balances system that effectively can prevent corporations from overly manipulating universities. Let's take, for example, the alumni. Would the alumni be satisfied, or would they sit back while this corporation comes in and just ruins all of their university's reputation or their course of study? Secondly, what about the other fields? What about the other fields that actually have a direct incentive and a direct influence on all these universities? Corporations, even if they can't own these universities, they can't just have a dictatorship. Owning a piece of society in this democratic world isn't just about dictatorship, and just like we don't allow any form of dictatorship within our democratic societies, the same goes here. Corporations cannot simply come in and just by their financial power, they simply cannot practically become dictators of that university. That is impractical, and that's why their policy doesn't have any effectiveness in this case. Thank you, sir. So they also talked about one of the examples that they gave to you was about the Hana High School. Where we say that creating a school in an already flooded market by a company, by a corporation, is a completely different concept than owning an already existing one, as we've just explained. Because an existing one already has these ties and influences within society. No, thank you, sir. And this prevents the dictatorship, and this prevents the over-manipulation of that corporations can have. So because throughout the case, they've just conceded that the status quo is okay. And also they said that anonymous financial funding can solve this somehow existing problem that they failed to show you in their case. So because they didn't firstly show you that problem, secondly, they didn't prove how their policy would solve this non-existing problem, and thirdly, because their policy is ineffective in itself and we've just proven how it is, we completely cannot agree to their case. So let's move on to our first argument. Our first argument is about the higher quality of education. Now, we want to talk about the characteristics of corporations. By owning universities, what we say is that corporations can heighten the quality of education that a university can provide. How? Thank you, sir. Let's examine the characteristics of a corporation, like they have done. corporations are one of the main components of society, yes, and many people are economically tied to corporations. And many people in today's society go to universities for a better chance of being hired by such a corporation. And the corporations also have the financial power to invest in universities. And at the same time, thank you, sir, corporations are very sensitive to social change. Why? Because their interests are directly related to social change. So with this financial power that they have, and with their interest and their sensitivity to social change, they have the power, corporations have the power to provide students with an education that is best fitting for the society, that is best fitting, thank you, sir, that can benefit the society. So on the first sub-level, they have the power to do so. And they also have the incentive to do so because of their need for a highly educated workforce. On the second sub-point of this point, corporations have greater incentive for higher education. Because firstly, their image is directly involved. Secondly, their workforce, is directly involved. And thirdly, because of their duty to society. Because of all these incentives, corporations do have a direct incentive to invest in that education. For example, let's look at Sungkyunkwan University. Their policy, Samsung Corporation's involvement with the Sungkyunkwan University brought the Sungkyunkwan University's medical students the chance to have an internship at Samsung hospitals that they had not had before. So as we see, their corporations being involved in having an ownership with the universities can actually bring students a higher level of education, better opportunities that they have not had before. So with that having been said, let's move on into the second argument about the greater opportunities. Now, in this case, we want to talk about the greater accessibility of education. We're going to do this in two subpoints. Now, we say that one of the main constraints that block even able students from going to college in today's society is the financial aspect of college. We all know this. Getting a college education is very expensive. So on the first sub-point, we want to say that owning universities gives corporations, firstly, because it gives corporations a direct incentive to provide more financial help to the workforce, to the potential workforce of able students. You're out of order, sir. And because they have a direct incentive to invest in this higher education, they're going to give more scholarships to those people, to the students who hope to attend that university. So this would actually firstly directly lower the initial financial burden put on even able students that they can't even go to college. But furthermore, on our second subpoint, we say that the higher prospects of a job draw more students to universities. Because universities have a direct say and they can actually have a direct link to those universities, these people, who, especially the people who consider college a luxury, or the people who could not afford college, they have a better incentive to go to college as well. So this promotes education within the society, even at a higher level. So this, in the end, benefits the society, the students, and the corporations, which is exactly why this is a win-win-win situation, which is exactly why their policy is unneeded and ineffective. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for the speech, and I now open the floor to the Deputy Prime Minister.
Our Prime Minister came up to you and gave you a clear policy in which we will still open corporations to fund universities if they still have the clean and pure intent to fund education and not corporate greed. Yet still the Leader of Opposition comes up here and says, what about the money? What about the funding? What about the jobs? Well, we tell you that all those things can still apply to our policy because what we're aiming for is keeping the integrity of education and driving the corporate forces out of the education policy, but we're still going to let them fund schools if they're interested in that. Now, our Prime Minister gave you two clear substantive points. Number one, the nature of education. And number two, the nature of ownership. And to this, the opposition had mainly two contentions. And to this, we have more than 10 points of refutations. Their first contention was about our policy. Now they said that anonymous funds and vocational schools are already in the status quo, and they're asking us if we're advocating that. And to this, we have 2 points of refutation. Number one, actually no, because we're fixing the biggest problem in the status quo, which is corporate ownership in universities that are obstructing research results. And secondly, if corporations can't directly own universities anymore, they'll be more incentivized to play a bigger role in anonymous funds and vocational schools. And we think this is a greater improvement on the status quo. Now, their second point of contention was about the nature of was about our substantive points. Firstly, they said that universities and corporations actually coincide with each other. But ladies and gentlemen, this is simply not true, because firstly, now they said corporations want the best for universities, but we see this is simply not true. Corporations want the best for themselves, not for the universities that invest in, and they're going to use the universities to portray a better image of themselves by trying to obstruct their research. For example, if Coca-Cola finds out that the civilians are mistrusting the level of calories it has, it's going to suddenly produce university results that Coca-Cola actually may be healthier for you. And in that way, companies can disrupt the flow of information. And secondly, they said that corporations can fund universities and universities need money. Well, that's why we still allow a channel to find the school. If they're still purely in for the education, they can fund the school and help their image in that way, instead of propagating false research. Now, they also said that owning a university is like owning a small part of society. Okay, so are they going to let universities own and corrupt that part of society into ways that fit their hands? Because we have to ask a very simple question. Who can better run universities better? Educators who are more incentivized to work for the students and to the education policies. And corporations' first incentive is to earn money, to earn profit for themselves, and we simply cannot see this coinciding with the university's main objectives, which is for better education and for better research. Now, they also attacked on our example of Hana High School, because they said that this was corporations building and owning a totally new school. Okay, that still fits into our definition of owning a school, and the Hana example still stands, and we'd like to see their deputy rebut on this point. Now that I've rebutted to all the points made by now that I've completely addressed the rebuttals, let us move on to their own case. Their first substantive point was about a higher quality of education, and here they try to say that universities would do just that, but we don't see their logic stand, because their first line of reasoning was that corporate is sensitive to social changes. Yes, this is our point exactly. Corporates are sensitive to the way the society sees the corporations, not the universities. That's why the corporation will try to use the research facilities in the universities in a way that best suits themselves and can best distort their company image to fit the society. And they also said that corporations' image is better involved. Yes, exactly. That's again our line of reasoning. We tell you that is still why they're going to try to destroy research results or try to swerve and maneuver the way of the research is working so that their company will look better. They mentioned the case of Songgyungwan and how they going to provide intern programs, but that's not mutually exclusive to our policy. Our policy includes just that. They could still have reach programs. If they want better students, they could first do anonymous funding, and secondly, do the bonds and collaterals and research programs clearly. They told you. Now, their second argument was about greater opportunity, and this was a basic regurgitation of their first substantive points. And basically, all their arguments only talk about funding, and how will universities get that? Well, we've told you again and again, they could first get funding by number one, anonymous funds, which will be increased by the fact that universities now can't have direct ownership of schools. And secondly, they talk about more jobs, and we still see that corporations and universities could make a bond with each other to make the students more into workers for their company, and we could see that they still could have inter-programs and research programs, because nothing in our policy said that we're going to ban that. And we must ask you the question, who is better suited to run a school? That is of corporations. Even if they still argue that corporations aren't going to play a major role in running the school, well, if you own more than 70% of the school, of course you're the major runner. We don't see their line of logic. Now that I've rebutted all their substantive point, let me move on to my own point, which is about the negative social cycle. Now, we see that corporations are going to encourage this sort of letting corporations run amok, taking over universities is going to encourage bad behavior. Because we see that under their model, the opposition's model, the problem expands as it goes. Because when one corporation starts owning a university, then more corporations will try to do so as well. More and more corporations will try to take control of the ownership of the universities, and more universities will fall under the grip of corporate greed. And if this turns into a social trend, then what's going to be the harm of this? Well, more companies investing completely in corporations, in universities, means that more and more unstable companies are going to own universities as well. As our Prime Minister told you, companies owning universities has many harms. Number one, it can obstruct researches and try to destroy what's going to happen to that. And number two, it's also financially insolvent in many situations, because we give you the example of the Great Depression or the hedge funds. When companies suddenly fall, what happens when companies fall? Well, the universities they own fall as well, and we don't want to see that happen to our education system, ladies and gentlemen, because we want what's best for the universities. And what's best for the university is keeping the integrity of education by keeping the corporations out of it. Because under their model, not only are the universities financially unstable because the corporations they own could be so, there is also the violation of the integrity of education because they can't research and invest in what they want. So if you're for the sanctity of our education system and for the integrity of research and the betterment of the universities, you're for side proposition, and we're very proud to propose. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 2 minutes and 9 seconds. I would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her speech, and I now give the floor to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
As the deputy leader of the opposition, I seriously have to question the government side for several things. But the first thing I want to question is, why are they saying the status quo is so great and saying that corporations owning universities are so bad when corporations owning universities is the status quo? Now, what they have said about the harms of corporate greed are all things that exist in the status quo. Some of their examples: Coca-Cola. It was through funding. Funding that they allow in their policy. What about Stanford? Their contaminated studies. Things they allow in their policy. And I'm sort of embarrassed to call this a policy, because what we see here is they gave a 4-step policy with 3 steps existing in the same way. So their policy that will magically clear up all the financial problems is just purely about them. The Prime Minister came up and talked about how wonderful the status quo is. So Yonsei University, Harvard, great. That's the status quo. The opposition today is advocating the status quo. Corporations can own universities. Does not banning mean every university is controlled by corporation? Do all corporations falter? Are they financially more unstable than boards of education? Are they all so greedy, contaminated, devoid of morals, and the public so stupid that they will fall for corporate distortion of everything that goes within a university. We believe the government is disregarding the status quo, which is exactly what the opposition is standing for.
Wait, sir.
They are unrealistic in portraying contaminated photos of what might happen in the future, when in reality, their examples are those from the status quo inside the policy that they advocated from the start. So we completely do not accept this. Moreover, let's talk a little bit more about funding. You don't allow corporations to own universities, and you let them donate anonymously. What kind of incentive does a corporation have to donate anonymously? We think this is ridiculous. We think that the government, the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister are coming up saying that, well, if we do this anonymously, they will be incentivized to give more. They will not be incentivized to give anything. That is why they fund for research projects that are in their interest, because they are interested in knowing what those questions are asked. And the contaminated things that the government side is so worried about is in their policy. Again, their own case contradicts their own position. Now, let's get into the specifics. What about their example of Hana High School? First of all, this is high school. Second of all, the high school market in Korea is so dreadfully flooded, as we all know, that creating a new high school wasn't probably the best choice to make. We see this as a very bad business decision that was taken on very amateurishly and was also had bad luck. So what we see here is that they throw out an example of a high school that wasn't prepared properly, and they say that corporations suddenly shouldn't control universities, whereas that is in the status quo that they're advocating. So that was dealt with Hana. And what about all their concerns about risk, about universities faltering if corporations stumble? Now, first of all, universities are very expensive to maintain. That means very large corporations can finally afford to have a university. No, thank you. Now, what we see here also is that large corporations are less susceptible to demolishing in an instant. What we see furthermore is that in the light of the recent 2008 global economic crisis, many schools that were not owned by corporations suddenly went bankrupt, had to close classes, kick out people, receive less students. They had to cut down on scholarships. Williams almost ran out of money. So what we see here is that just saying that corporations can falter doesn't hide the fact that every single board of education can falter as well, and also that corporations have a better sense of financial planning, and they actually might be less susceptible to financial collapse because they are big, they're smart about money. So what we see here is that they are grossly overportraying the situation. What about our own arguments about higher quality? Our first argument was rebutted by, well, distortion. As we already said, that contradicts their own stance. What about their saying that Sungyungan University is not mutually exclusive? Well, we only talked about interns. Let's get into the scholarships that a lot of students in Sungyungan University gets. Because of those scholarships, they have to get to study. What about the amazing facilities at Sungyungan University? Because Samsung pours so much money into that. We would like to no thank you. And we don't think this can be achieved through anonymous funding in which the companies get no, reward, because this has no incentive whatsoever. And what about our second argument about greater educational opportunities? Thank you. They said it's all about funding, and corporations will become greedy. We think that funding is important. We think money always helps in education. We think that if companies take over universities and can offer better scholarships, this lets poor people get a better education. This lets kids get a better quality of education. We think that this is very important. And just saying this is funding, and just saying that, corporate greed will take over, we think this is totally unbased in fact, and they have grossly underplayed how important education is, how important the freedom and opportunities for higher education is, and they're ignoring the realities of society in which money is really important, and we can't get that without proper incentives. So I would like to move on to my third argument about the contribution to society. Nowadays, many students go to university for a job. They fail to find one. Many corporations are also seeking new employers, but they are often dissatisfied with their results. What we see here is students trying their hand at weird licenses and TOEICs for many, many years, wasting their time, corporations wasting their time as well, and society being very unhappy about this, and wasting time and resources. It is very inefficient. And what we see here is that those cooperation programs that they mentioned are a step towards this. But the corporations getting to control universities in a more fundamental way by letting the students have better facilities, letting the students be able to receive education that is on the cutting edge of society, because corporations have to keep in touch with the market. We think that these things will offer students a better education, offer employers better employees, and thus they will waste less time and resources. So students waste less time and resources and money, corporations can recruit better people, society benefits from economic growth and less jobless people, and we think that this is a win-win-win situation. Again, a win-win-win situation. For that, we believe the opposition stands.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 27 seconds. I would like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for his speech, and I now open the floor to the Speaker from the government.
The Deputy Leader of Opposition came up to this podium and gave us the example of Coca-Cola, Stanford, and Sungkyunkwan, and basically mentioned that these were examples of the status quo. And then they said that if we employed anonymous funds in our policy, there would be basically no incentive. Well, we see a contradiction here, because the Leader of Opposition came up to the podium and said that there was an inherent incentivization, inherent incentive in getting better workers as a result. If they want better workers, then that is the incentive of anonymous funding. Because no matter if that funding is anonymous or named by the company, they are still going to get better workers. Now, if the Deputy Leader of Opposition comes up and says that there is no incentives in anonymous funds, then this is a big contradiction. And we tried to understand why there was a contradiction, why they would have made this mistake in thought processes. And we thought that that may be because they recognize the fact that when companies fund universities in non-anonymous procedures, they are actually holding a monopoly over the potential workers that come out of these companies. And we believe this is wrong because they also ignored an inherent value in education itself. Because they completely ignored the fact that education is not, the final destination of education is not to work in a big fat corporation with a heavy paycheck. There is a value in education that cannot be corrupted by corporate greed. And this is what we are here to advocate. And this is why we believe that owning universities by companies should be banned. And also, our second argument regarding financial status, how when a company goes down, that university owned by the company also goes down, and how also research, the integrity of that research can be flawed. These arguments were completely dropped by the Deputy Leader of Opposition and Leader of Opposition. So we want the opposition whip at least to come up and say some sort of response to this argument. Also, regarding their third argument of societal benefits, we see this as an inherent contradiction in their stance as well. Because the Leader of Opposition came up and said that what the corporation was doing by owning a university was owning a small part of society. Now you can't own a small part of society because that kind of influence can only be built by the government or by the people itself, because the people own the society, not the corporation. We see this as a contradiction as well. But now let's take a step back. Let's look at the bigger picture of this debate. We inherently see three misconceptions of the opposition side. The first was that the concept of owning and funding was misconstrued. Owning is is complete influence as clearly defined in our definition. And complete influence often leads to corruption and harms that we cannot mitigate in the current status quo. They said that we were advocating the status quo, but that is not true. This is another misconception. They think our policy is the status quo. But that's because in our policy, we try to still maintain the benefits we have of corporate funding and at the same time try to eradicate the harms. And in that process, we did have to recognize and concede to the fact that funding in a way is effective. And funding is effective, but we're saying that ownership is going too far. Ownership, 100% influence, is much of an extremity that we cannot simply let go and buy. See, and the government has to intervene at this step. The third and final misconception was that education was simply for getting a good job. Education itself, in itself, has an inherent value, and that value of education, that value that is instilled into these students in the universities, can be corrupted and would probably be corrupted if corporations can influence them in such a strong way. And since we cannot let that pass by, since we believe that ultimately, and as mentioned by our Deputy Prime Minister, if we let one case by, then other corporations will follow, and eventually the very concept and very value of education would be devastated. And because we want to uphold that value, we are here very proud to propose. Now let's move on to the three clashes we defined in this debate. Basically, the three clashes were first on the purpose of the companies, second on the quality of education, and third on societal effects. We move on to our first clash of purpose. Now, as we mentioned briefly in the introduction, there was a real big contradiction here because they said the purpose of companies was, because we said, on the government side, that the purpose of companies was to profit. And they said the purpose of companies coincides with the purpose of universities in that they want good workers. No, this is not true. Because as it says, good workers can only focus in certain parts of education, in technology, in the field that the corporations fund. But education in universities can be carried out in different parts of studies as well. Justice, law, values that can be instilled, but that cannot benefit the corporations. Corporations do not encourage this kind of education. And because corporations cannot provide a comprehensive education to these students, we are trying to do that for them, for these students. And that's why we're standing for society, and we're standing for the government, and eventually we're starting with good workers for good companies, and that is why we are the win-win-win situation here, not them. Now, we also mentioned that highly educated workforce is no different from funding too, because the status quo is actually mostly funding by universities, not ownership. They kept on mentioning that ownership in the company is the status quo. We challenged them to bring us one single example of how that ownership of the company is really different and much more beneficent and much more efficient than the funding of universities. No, sir. Funding of universities. And since they cannot bring out that differentiation, since they cannot justify ownership as a much better choice than funding, and how all those benefits can be substituted by funding, and we can mitigate and eradicate the harms of ownership, and that is why our policy stands. Since they can't do that, they fail to defend their case as well. Yes, sir.
So why are you ignoring our example of Sungkyunkwan University, which I stated in my last speech?
Well, your example of Sungkyunkwan University is an example of ownership, but you never fail to exemplify why that is particularly great, why that cannot be turned to funding. If Samsung funds Sungkyunkwan, then there are extreme harms in that case. If they simply fund Sungkyunkwan, and because Sungkyunkwan could be corrupted under our example of the integrity of research, and if Samsung goes down, then Sungkyunkwan goes down as well, according to our logic. Now, they never really refuted to these logic, and they kept on saying that there was some kind of harm if we do so. If Sungkyunkwan is funded instead of owned, no, sir, we're replying. Now, if Sungkyunkwan is funded instead of owned, then what is the harm there? What is the difference? We say that difference is that there is a lack of complete influence, because at this point there is much more influence in that funding, and we believe that a 75% of the shareholding or 100% ownership is too much of an influence that we can bear, and that's why we take this clash. We prove what kind of purpose the corporations really have, and that is why we have the value on our side, inherent value of education. Now, the quality of education is a very brief clash, because basically all the arguments they said, the first and second arguments, are applicable in our case as well. Because the values that they instilled, the values of higher education, good quality education, good facilities, can also be funded in our case, instead in anonymous ways, so we can eradicate the harms as well. Now, and when we said that there was the danger of destroying the integrity of research, and that there was the danger of a good university and good researchers falling for the sake of the corporations, because corporations inherently carry and bear a risk in doing their activities, then we say that they fail to defend their case again. That we actually have a more stable way of providing quality. So we have a more better quality for these companies, for these universities as well. So we take this clash as well. Now the third clash in societal effects is again very brief, because the only societal effect they brought was that universities, that corporations can somehow, by owning universities, that they own a small part of society according to the leader of opposition. This does not stand. And then in the deputy leader of opposition speech, he also conceded that cooperative programs of partnership can be good. So they conceded to a part of our policy that it could be effective. And this kind of partnership needs to be more actively encouraged and more actively expanded, and that is why it was in our partnership. And we also promoted, and we also clearly exemplified to you that when we allow one or two instances of corporations owning a university allowed, then other corporations will follow because they see the clear benefit of it. And we want to stop this. And because we want to stop all these greed and corporate behavior, we are here very proud to propose. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 30 seconds. I would like to thank the one speaker from the government, and I now open the floor to the opposition whip.
Before moving on any further, I'd like to first tell you that the burden of the government, as you may very well know, is to prove the motion, and that the burden actually lies on the government. So if they come up and tell us that Songyungan was actually good, but that other measures could be implemented as well, they fail to meet their burden. Because it doesn't really matter. Because what they need to show is that their policy is much better than anything else. But they say that just because other measures are possible, that their policy is simply good, it's failing logic, ladies and gentlemen. And with that being said, I'd like to move on to my speech. So they try to portray and frame this debate into a confrontation between the inherent value of education and corporate greed. But it isn't really that way. Inherent value, great, we do appreciate the inherent value. But do they actually show any case of corporate ownership taking that value away? They told us Stanford, they told us Coca-Cola, but these companies, ExxonMobil did not own Stanford University, not 75% of its shares. What about Coca-Cola? It doesn't own the university, not to my knowledge. And what are they saying? Research funding, corporate ownership? No, thank you. It doesn't fit with their definition. And these are the only examples that they provided. And by that alone, they cannot possibly take this debate home. Also, we tell you that this inherent value of education sometimes does require financial resources. And when you incentivize corporations to give in to that cause, then corporations will actually create a win-win for society, for universities, and also for corporations. Well, now it's a win-win-win. Now, let's move on to our 3 points of contention. So I told you, first of all, that it's not corporate greed versus value of education. And now, with that being established, points of contention. Firstly, the quality of education. Secondly, about research and distortion about research. And lastly, about practicality. So moving on to our first point of contention, about the quality of education. Team government said something about corporate greed, how they'll use everything for its own interest, nothing for the university. They say that they will create a monopoly of education, that they'll produce all the people and distort them and manipulate them into the model that they want. But it isn't really the case. And we provide you three levels of refutation to this. First of all, they can't change everything for profit, or at least they can't change everything according to its own will, because there's a check system. We told you about the alumni. If you tell the alumni that they're going to shut down your department, will they say nothing, ladies and gentlemen? If the English literature department is told to be shut down, with thousands of people who graduated from that department say, okay, let's do as you wish, these people in many prestigious universities, without congressmen, millionaires, would these people say nothing? Of course they would say something. Another thing, what about student governments, student organizations? They protest higher school fees. They lead revolutions in countries like Tunisia. They led revolutions in countries like Korea. Will they say nothing if their entire university is being reconstructed by corporate greed? Also, what about society's eyes? What about the press? Would public opinion say nothing when Samsung says, let's change everything and make this into a Samsung factory, ladies and gentlemen? Of course not, ladies and gentlemen. We told you 3 effective ways of the check and balance system that would prevent corporate greed from dominating the university campus. Also, most importantly, what about choice? Other schools exist. What about SNU that's public funded? What about Yonsei University? What about all these things that are done by charitable foundations on an individual basis? These schools exist, and these schools are alternatives. Students can easily go there, and we'll have a wider variety, ladies and gentlemen. What's so problematic about that? And also, as they say, corporations are so powerful, their policy fails to prevent corporations from exerting their influence. Because banning corporations from owning schools, because corporations don't exert influence with just owning schools. They can take a variety of other measures. They can lobby the government. They can buy seats in the board of directors. They can provide funding with conditions. All of these things that corporations can do. And when this takes place, none of the benefits that they argue about the pristine inherent value of education will be realized. Because corporations, if they're as almighty as they portray, will have their way of gaining in and saying and exerting their voice. Also, let's move on to our second part about this point of contention. That corporations can indeed provide better conditions for students. They can provide better professors, because professors aren't, in many cases, aren't so much attracted by this inherent value of education without money, because they prefer inherent value of education with better conditions for research, with better pay, and with giving them the ability to send their children to better schools and allowing their wives to eat at good restaurants. They prefer better conditions, ladies and gentlemen. Corporations with their investments can actually provide that. They can provide better environments for these people to engage in their academic work. What about better facilities? You told me about Samsung Hospital, no, thank you. What about Postec? It's being funded by Poststeel, which is one of the world's major steel manufacturers. They have the financial ability to give in to the pure sciences. And they actually, in the natural sciences, they allow these students to pursue their interests. They give a lot of pay, scholarships to study at MIT. They give these opportunities to students because they have the financial ability to do so, ladies and gentlemen. And also, let's move on to another part about greater opportunity. Poor kids will get, no, thank you. Poor kids will earn more scholarships. And because many poor kids fear that university education is a luxury, if you actually tell them that if you go to this university and go to this program that this new corporation actually put in, and that you'll have a greater chance of being employed, then they'll fear less, and they'll be more willing to go into these programs and receive a higher level of education. What we're doing is encouraging more poor kids to climb up that social ladder through more accessible education. Moving on to our second point of contention about research and distortion. Their only examples are Stanford and Coca-Cola, which have no relevance in today's debate because it's about corporate ownership, not corporate funding, ladies and gentlemen. And having that set aside, let's move on to our second point of refutation. That the government cannot prevent corporations from interacting with universities at all. I told you this. Corporations do have other means of exerting their influences, of reaching out and making known of their voices through other means. I told you that individual donors, most of these millionaires, are, in fact, business tycoons. Even if you restrict all corporations from exerting their influences, individuals who are CEOs of major companies will actually attach conditions to many of their donations. And what can that do? That can also exert indirect influences, maybe direct influences on how the university is being run, ladies and gentlemen. This distortion they say, if it exists, it will take anyway with their policy. What we do is, at least with corporations, they can give back to the university with large sums and charitable donations. And with that, you can improve the quality of education, which is going to be so beneficial to students. And lastly, with our last point of refutation, the check and balance system. Government intervention, the law, court orders can prevent a distortion of research, as they showed us. What about the public God, public side, and the press? These things can also work to implement a check system on this distortion. Last point of contention, quickly, about practicality. They say let's donate anonymously. They say there's an incentive for corporations because they want better workers anyway. We know from common sense that this really isn't the case. What kind of incentive is this? Samsung wants a better image. It's one of the main reasons